is a particular kind of silence that settles over an English village after something terrible has happened. It is not the silence of peace, not the kind you find on a Sunday morning when the church bells have just stopped ringing and the air smells of fresh bread and wet grass. No, this silence is different. It has weight to it. It presses down on the rooftops and creeps along the garden walls and sits at kitchen tables where families eat their breakfasts without looking at each other. Mellowbrook knew this silence well. It was a village of approximately 400 souls, if you counted generously, and included old Mrs. Pimberry, who hadn't left her cottage in 3 years, and whose existence was confirmed only by the weekly milk delivery and the occasional curl of chimney smoke. It sat in a shallow valley in the English countryside, cradled by low hills and a river that moved so slowly in summer it seemed to have given up entirely. There was one church, one post office that also sold sweets and tobacco, one public house called the Drowning Crow, a name that had always struck visitors as unnecessarily grim, and the kind of deep, watchful community that had been observing itself for so many generations that it had developed an almost clinical understanding of human nature. People in Mellowbrook knew things. They knew which marriages were failing before the couples did. They knew who drank too much and who borrowed money they had no intention of returning. They knew the history of every house, every field, every old grudge that had been carefully wrapped in politeness and passed down like a family heirloom from one generation to the next. And yet, for all that knowing, they had not seen this coming. Perhaps that is the cruelest trick that evil plays. It does not arrive wearing a dark coat and carrying its intentions plainly. It arrives at dinner parties. It pours the wine. It laughs at the right moments and asks after your health with apparent sincerity. It has been your neighbor for years, or your doctor, or the man who once helped you when your motor car broke down on a rainy road outside of town. Evil, in Mellowbrook, had very good manners. Sir Edmund Hargrove had been many things to many people, and most of those things were not particularly kind. He was wealthy in the way that old English families sometimes are, not through any recent effort or talent, but through accumulated land and accumulated silence about how that land was originally obtained. He was sharp-tongued and sharp-minded, and had spent the better part of 63 years making sure that the world bent to accommodate him rather than the other way around. He had a son who feared him, a niece who quietly despised him, a servant who had suffered greatly at his hands, and a friend, a dear, close, trusted friend, who smiled at him across dinner tables and harbored, behind those warm eyes, something cold enough to kill. When Sir Edmund was found dead on the morning of October the 14th, slumped in his chair in the drawing-room of a Hargrove House, with an overturned wine-glass near his right hand, and the particular gray stillness about his face that leaves no room for doubt, the village of Mellowbrook exhaled. It was not a proud exhalation. Nobody celebrated. But the silence that followed was different from the silence that had existed while Sir Edmund was alive. It was, in some difficult way to articulate, a slightly more honest silence, and into that silence 3 people walked forward and said, "I did it." This is the part that the newspapers, had they covered the story properly, would have found most extraordinary. Not the murder itself. English country houses had been producing murdered aristocrats with reliable frequency for centuries, and the reading public had developed a certain appetite for it. No, The extraordinary thing was the confessions, 3 of them, separate, voluntary. Each one delivered with the quiet conviction of a person who has made peace with a difficult decision. Inspector Graves of the local constabulary, who was a decent man but not a particularly imaginative one, found himself standing in the Mellowbrook Village Hall at 9:30 in the morning with 3 confessed murderers, 1 corpse, and absolutely no idea what to do next. It was at this precise moment, as it so often is in the affairs of Mellowbrook and a dozen villages like it scattered across the English countryside, that Miss Jane Marple appeared. She had not been summoned. She had not been called in as a consultant or an expert or any official capacity whatsoever. She was 71 years old. She carried a knitting bag, and she had come to Mellowbrook to visit her Batagie, her niece, who had recently moved to the village after her marriage. She had stopped at the greengrocer's for some carrots. She had overheard a conversation, and now she stood at the edge of everything, her pale blue eyes moving with the quiet, unhurried precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime watching human beings make the same essential mistakes in slightly different costumes. And she thought to herself, with the particular sadness of someone who already knows how a story ends, the guilty one is still smiling. What follows is not a story about death, though death is present throughout. It is a story about love, the fierce, irrational, self-destructive kind that makes ordinary people do extraordinary things. It is about guilt that belongs to those who are innocent, and innocence worn like armor by those who are not. It is about a village that thought it knew everything and missed the one thing that mattered. And it is about a small, white-haired old woman with a knitting bag and a habit of mentioning her village of St. Mary Mead at seemingly irrelevant moments, who understood, better than anyone, that the human heart is not a mystery at all. It is, in fact, entirely predictable, if you know how to look. Chapter 1. A Village That Sleeps Too Quietly. October in Mellowbrook arrived the way it always did, without asking permission. One morning the trees were still green, holding on to summer with the quiet stubbornness of old things that do not surrender easily, and then, almost overnight, they turned. Gold first, then amber, then a deep, burning rust that made the whole valley look as though something beneath the earth had caught fire and was slowly working its way to the surface. The river, already sluggish from a dry September, turned the color of weak tea. The mornings came with frost on the window panes and the smell of wood smoke and something else, something older, harder to name, that English autumns carry with them like a memory that refuses to fade. The village woke later in October. It pulled its curtains tighter and lit its lamps earlier, and retreated, collectively, into itself. Gardens were put to bed. Bicycles were leaned against walls and left there. The drowning crow became warmer and louder as the evenings shortened, and old men who had been sitting on benches outside all summer migrated indoors to their usual corners, their usual pints, their usual complaints about the weather they had seen coming for weeks. It was, in other words, a perfectly ordinary English October. Except that in Mellowbrook something was wrong. You would not have been able to point to it immediately. It was not visible in any single thing. The post office opened on time. The church held its Tuesday flower-arranging meeting without incident. Children walked to school in their scarves and Wellington boots, kicking leaves into the gutters with the wholehearted commitment that only children bring to purposeless destruction. On the surface, Mellowbrook looked exactly as it always looked, a village preserved in its own particular amber, unchanged and unchanging. But if you had lived there long enough, if you had eaten enough meals in its kitchens and attended enough of its funerals and sat through enough of its long winter evenings, listening to people say one thing while meaning another, you would have felt it, a tightness in conversations that ended a beat too soon, eyes that moved away a moment before they should, the specific quality of silence that falls when you enter a room and realize the people inside were just talking about someone. They were talking about Hargrove House. Hargrove House stood at the northern edge of the village, separated from the rest of Mellowbrook by a long gravel drive lined with elm trees so old that their roots had begun pushing up through the ground, like the knuckles of a buried hand reaching upward. The house itself was impressive in the way that English country houses often are, not beautiful exactly, but large and permanent and absolutely certain of its own importance. It had 17 rooms, 12 of which were in regular use, and 5 of which Sir Edmund kept locked for reasons he had never explained to anyone. It had a walled garden that had once been magnificent and was now merely large. It had a view across the valley that on clear days extended all the way to the church spire of the next village, 4 miles distant. And it had Sir Edmund Hargrove, who had lived in it for 40 years, and managed, in that time, to make it feel smaller than it was. Sir Edmund was the kind of man who filled rooms, not with warmth or generosity or particular charm, but with the sheer gravitational certainty of someone who has never once doubted his right to be the most important person present. He was tall, still, at 63, though age had thickened him through the middle and put a permanent shadow beneath his eyes. He dressed well without vanity, good suits worn with the casualness of a man for whom good suits are simply what one wears, like skin. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and his own particular talent for finding the precise thing to say that would make another person feel slightly smaller than they had felt a moment before. He was not universally hated. That would have been simpler. Some people in Mellowbrook genuinely respected him, or at least respected what he represented. Old money, old name, old certainties in a world that seemed to be discarding its certainties at an alarming rate. He served on the parish council. He donated, reliably, if not generously, to the Church Restoration Fund. He employed several people from the village, including Mr. Albert Pott, who had worked at Hargrove House for 22 years as general handyman, a gardener, and the kind of all-purpose servant that large old houses quietly depend upon, and rarely properly acknowledge. But respect and affection are different things. And Sir Edmund, if he knew the difference, had never seemed particularly interested in pursuing the latter. His son, Thomas, was 31, and lived in the east wing of Hargrove House with the uncomfortable energy of a man waiting for his life to actually begin. He had his father's height and none of his certainty. Where Sir Edmund moved through the world like something inevitable, Thomas moved through it like something apologetic, always slightly hunched, always slightly braced, as though expecting impact. He had tried, at various points, to establish himself independently. A business venture in London that had quietly failed, a period working for a firm in Bristol that had ended with a phone call home that nobody in the house had been allowed to discuss afterward. He had come back to Mellowbrook 2 years ago and had not left since, and the question of when he would, and what exactly he was waiting for, had become one of those subjects the household navigated around in careful silence. His cousin, Cecily, Sir Edmund's niece, strictly speaking the daughter of his late sister, had arrived at Hargrove House 6 months ago under circumstances that were described, publicly, as a visit that had simply extended itself. She was 26, with her mother's dark hair and a particular quality of watchful stillness that people sometimes mistook for shyness, and that was, in fact, something considerably more complicated. She was engaged, or had been engaged, to a young man from Dorset named William Ashford, and that engagement had been, in some way that Cecily declined to discuss in detail, connected to Sir Edmund and connected to her ongoing presence at Hargrove House, and connected to the expression she wore sometimes at dinner when she thought nobody was watching her. These were the people under one roof. These were the people who woke on the morning of October the 14th to find Sir Edmund Hargrove dead in his chair. And these were the people, along with one quietly suffering old servant, who would each, in their own way and their own time, walk forward and say the words that Inspector Graves had never in his career expected to hear 3 times before his second cup of tea. I killed him. It was me. I am the one you want. The village of Mellowbrook listened, and somewhere in its listening, in its long, careful, accumulated understanding of human nature, the answer was already there, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Chapter 2. The night Sir Edmund died. Dinner parties at Hargrove House had a particular rhythm to them. They began formally, Sir Edmund at the head of the table, straight-backed and deliberate, the candlelight doing the charitable work that daylight refused to do, softening the harder edges of the room and the man who occupied it. The good china came out. The silver was polished to a brightness that felt slightly accusatory in its perfection. Mrs. Hedges, who cooked for the household 3 evenings a week and had done so for 11 years, produced food that was reliably excellent, and served it with the expression of a woman who has learned to be invisible in other people's important moments. The guests on the evening of October the 13th were not strangers to this rhythm. They had all sat at this table before, in various combinations, on various occasions. They knew which chair creaked. They knew that Sir Edmund preferred the conversation to move in directions he had selected, and that steering it elsewhere required a particular kind of courage, or a particular kind of foolishness. The two being, at Hargrove House, difficult to distinguish. There were 6 of them that evening, including Sir Edmund himself. Thomas sat to his father's left, as he always did, a positioning that had always struck Cecily as quietly symbolic, the son placed not beside the father, but in the shadow of his left hand. Cecily sat across from Thomas, near enough to catch his eye when necessary, and they had developed over months of these dinners a private language of small glances that said the things that could not be said aloud in that house. Mr. Albert Pott did not dine with the family. He never had. But he moved through the evening in his usual capacity, appearing when needed and disappearing when not. A man so practiced in the art of invisibility that people sometimes forgot he was present even while looking directly at him. And then there was Dr. Aldous Fenwick. Dr. Fenwick was 58, with silver hair that he wore slightly longer than was strictly conventional, and the kind of face that inspired immediate confidence, open, attentive, lined in ways that suggested wisdom rather than simply age. He had been Sir Edmund's physician for 12 years, and his friend, apparently, for nearly as long, one of those friendships between men of a certain generation that is expressed not through warmth or particular tenderness, but through reliability. Fenwick came to dinner. Fenwick was consulted on matters beyond the strictly medical. Fenwick was, in the vocabulary of Hargrove House, simply trusted, a word that Sir Edmund deployed so rarely that its application to any person carried the weight of something significant. He arrived at 7 o'clock with a bottle of wine from his own cellar, a Burgundy, he explained, that he had been saving for a suitable occasion, and that he presented to Sir Edmund with the casual generosity of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. Sir Edmund received it with the particular half-smile he reserved for gestures he approved of, turned the bottle once in his hands, and handed it to Thomas to open. It was a small moment, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happens 1,000 times at dinner tables across England on any given evening. Nobody thought anything of it. The dinner itself passed in the way that dinners at Hargrove House typically passed, with surface pleasantness stretched over undercurrents that everyone present was aware of, and none of them directly acknowledged. Sir Edmund spoke about the village council, about a planning dispute involving a farmer on the eastern boundary of his property, and about a letter he had received from his solicitor that he mentioned obliquely and did not explain. He was in reasonable spirits, not warm, never warm, but engaged, present, conducting the evening with his usual proprietorial confidence. Thomas was quiet. This was not unusual. Cecily answered questions put to her directly and volunteered nothing further. This also was not unusual. Dr. Fenwick was charming, asking questions, listening with apparent genuine interest, refilling glasses with the attentiveness of a good guest. He complimented Mrs. Hedges Lamb when she appeared briefly to clear the second course. He told a story about a patient, anonymized, tastefully altered, that made Sir Edmund laugh. It was one of perhaps 3 genuine laughs that Hargrove House produced in any given month, and it landed in the room with the slight surprise of an unexpected sound. The Burgundy was opened, poured, drunk. Sir Edmund took his evening medication at the table, as was his habit, 3 small pills that Dr. Fenwick had prescribed for his heart, washed down with the last of his wine. He had done this for 2 years. It had become so unremarkable a part of the dinner ritual that it registered on nobody's consciousness as anything other than what it appeared to be. An old man managing his health with the mild resignation of someone who has accepted that the body, eventually, requires maintenance. He set the glass down. He continued talking. By 9:30, the dinner was finished, and the guests had moved to the drawing-room for coffee. The conversation had become quieter, the particular quietness of an evening winding down, people retreating into their own tiredness. Cecily excused herself first around 10 o'clock, with the slightly formal politeness she always used when removing herself from Sir Edmund's presence, as though she were addressing a minor official rather than a family member. Thomas followed 20 minutes later, pausing at the door with the look of a man who wants to say something and has decided, for the 10,000th time, not to. Dr. Fenwick stayed until nearly 11. He and Sir Edmund talked in the drawing-room about what nobody could afterwards say with certainty, and when he finally rose to leave, he shook Sir Edmund's hand at the front door with the warmth of a man who has had a genuinely pleasant evening. "Good night, Edmund." "Good night, Aldous. Drive carefully." The door closed. The house settled into its nighttime silence. At 6:45 the following morning, Mrs. Hedges arrived to begin breakfast and found the drawing-room light still burning. She found the coffee cup, cold and untouched, on the side table. She found the overturned wine glass on the floor beside the chair. The burgundy long since dried into a dark stain on the carpet that would never fully come out, no matter how many times it was subsequently cleaned. And she found Sir Edmund Hargrove, still in his dinner clothes, his head tilted slightly to the left, his right hand resting open on the arm of the chair as though he had simply let something go. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she sat down on the floor, not in any dramatic way, but simply because her legs stopped working. And she stayed there until Thomas came downstairs and found her, and stood very still in the doorway looking at his father, and said nothing at all for almost a full minute. What he felt in that silence, whether it was grief or relief or some unbearable mixture of both that has no clean name in any language, he never told anyone. Perhaps he didn't know himself. The doctor was called, then the police. Inspector Graves arrived at Hargrove House at 8:15, stepping out of his motor car into the cold October morning with the expression of a man who had hoped, sincerely, for a quiet week. He was met at the door by Thomas, who had composed himself by this point into a careful blankness, and was led to the drawing-room where Sir Edmund still sat, the local doctor having confirmed death and the approximate time of it, sometime between 11 and 1, and having noted with professional gravity that the circumstances suggested something that required rather more investigation than a quiet country death typically warranted. Poison, most likely, the wine glass, possibly the medication, possibly both. Inspector Graves looked at Sir Edmund Hargrove in his chair and thought, with the uncomfortable honesty that sometimes ambushes even the most professionally composed police officers, that the man looked, in death, rather more peaceful than he had ever looked in life. He wrote that thought down in no notebook. He said it to no one. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Graves was standing in the village hall. Across the table from him sat 3 people who had arrived separately at different times, within the space of 40 minutes, each one asking for whoever was in charge, each one folding their hands on the table and saying, with the quiet certainty of people who have made irrevocable decisions, "I need to confess." Chapter 3. 3 Confessions Before Breakfast. Inspector Graves had been a police officer for 26 years. He had handled pub fights and petty thefts, and one memorable incident involving a stolen goat that had somehow ended up in the post office. He had delivered bad news to families at their front doors and sat across tables from men who lied to him with impressive creativity, and women who told him truths he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely prepared for. He had, in other words, accumulated a reasonable working knowledge of the range of things that human beings are capable of doing to each other and to themselves. But he had never, in 26 years, had 3 separate people confess to the same murder before he had finished his morning tea. He sat at the head of the village hall table, a long, scarred piece of oak that had hosted harvest suppers and parish meetings, and at least one very heated argument about the appropriate height of a proposed garden wall, and looked at the 3 people arranged before him with the expression of a man whose professional frameworks are failing him in real time. To his left, Thomas Hargrove, 31, the dead man's son. To his right, Miss Cecily Marsh, 26, the dead man's niece. At the far end, hands folded with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time to arrive at this moment. Mr. Albert Pott, 64, who had worked at Hargrove House for 22 years, and whose face carried the weathered patience of old wood. 3 people, 3 confessions, one corpse still sitting in its chair 400 yards up the road. Inspector Graves picked up his pencil. He put it down again. He said, with admirable restraint, "Perhaps we should do this one at a time." Thomas Hargrove went first. He had asked to go first, had actually said the words, "I should like to go first," with a quiet formality that Graves found both admirable and deeply suspicious. He sat straight in his chair, hands flat on the table, and spoke in the measured tone of a man who has rehearsed something so many times that it has lost whatever emotion it originally carried and become simply a sequence of words to be delivered in the correct order. He said that he had poisoned his father. He said he had obtained the substance. He used the word substance, careful, clinical, as though distance from the specifics might somehow make the specifics less true. 3 weeks prior, through a contact in London, whose name he declined to provide. He said he had introduced it into his father's evening medication on the night of October the 13th. He said his motive was straightforward. Sir Edmund had been in the process of altering his will in a manner that would have left Thomas with effectively nothing. The estate to be placed in a trust, the house sold, the proceeds distributed to institutions Sir Edmund approved of, and Thomas did not. He said he had discovered this through a letter he was not meant to see, left open on his father's desk on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago. He said he was sorry. He said it once, briefly, and then stopped talking and looked at a fixed point on the wall above Graves's head with the expression of a man who has said everything he intended to say. Graves wrote it all down. He did not point out yet the 3 significant problems with Thomas's account. Cecily Marsh spoke next, and she spoke differently. Where Thomas had been controlled, Cecily had the quality of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has finally, deliberately, opened their hands. She did not look at Thomas. She did not look at Mr. Pott. She looked directly at Inspector Graves with the dark, steady eyes of a woman who has made a decision and intends to stand behind it regardless of what it costs her. She said she had poisoned Sir Edmund. She said she had been planning it for 4 months, since June, when Sir Edmund had made it definitively clear that her engagement to William Ashford would not receive his approval, his blessing, or, more critically, the financial support that William's family had been led to believe would accompany Cecily from Hargrove House. She explained, without drama, that Sir Edmund had contacted William's father directly, that he had communicated certain things about Cecily's character and circumstances that were, she said with careful precision, not entirely accurate, but entirely effective. That the engagement had been quietly dissolved a month later through a letter from William that she had read 4 times and then burned in the kitchen fireplace. She said she had obtained the poison through means she would explain in full to whoever needed to know. She said she had put it in the wine, the Burgundy, specifically, knowing it was Sir Edmund's preferred glass, and that he would drink most of the bottle himself, as he invariably did with wines he considered exceptional. She said she did not regret it. She said this last part quietly, almost gently, as though she were simply reporting a factual observation about her own internal state, rather than making a moral declaration. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Mr. Albert Pott did not so much confess as arrive at his confession, the way a river arrives at the sea, slowly, inevitably, through a landscape that explained everything about the journey. He began, not with what he had done, but with his son. His son's name was Daniel Pott, 29, who had worked briefly as a groundskeeper on the Hargrove estate 4 years ago, and who had been dismissed and subsequently reported to the police by Sir Edmund personally, following an incident involving a discrepancy in the estate accounts that Daniel had always maintained was a misunderstanding, and that Sir Edmund had chosen to characterize as theft. Daniel had served 14 months. He had come out of prison changed in ways that Albert Pott described with a father's specific, a helpless grief, not dramatically changed, not violently changed, but quietly diminished, as though something essential had been taken from him and had not been returned and could not be replaced. Daniel now lived in Birmingham. He did not come home for Christmas. Albert Pott had worked at Hargrove House for 18 more months after his son's imprisonment. He had trimmed the hedges and maintained the garden, and carried logs and answered when called and said, "Yes, sir," and "Of course, sir," and "Right away, sir," and had done all of this with the surface compliance of a man who has buried something very deep and is uncertain whether it will stay buried. It had not, in the end, stayed buried. He said he had put poison in Sir Edmund's medication bottle, not on the night of the dinner party, before, a week before. He had access to the medicine cabinet. He had always had access to the medicine cabinet. Nobody had ever thought to question this, because nobody had ever thought to question Albert Pott, who had been quietly present in that house for 22 years, and had become, like the furniture and the elm trees on the drive, simply part of the landscape. He said his son deserved better. He said Sir Edmund had known the account's discrepancy was not theft, and had reported Daniel anyway, for reasons that Albert had come to believe were simply about power, the exercise of it, the pleasure of it, the reminder to everyone in his orbit that he could. He said he would accept whatever came next. And then he said nothing further, and the village hall was very quiet. And outside the window, a single crow landed on the war memorial opposite, looked around with brief professional interest, and flew away again. Inspector Graves sat with 3 signed statements before him, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that something was profoundly wrong, not with the confessions themselves, but with the way they fitted together, or rather, the way they didn't. 3 people claiming 3 different methods, 3 different timings, 3 different delivery mechanisms for the same death, a death that, chemically, could only have had one cause. He was still sitting with this problem, turning it over with the helpless concentration of a man trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from 3 different boxes, when the door to the village hall opened, and a small, white-haired woman came in carrying a knitting bag and a brown paper parcel of carrots, and looked around the room with pale blue eyes that missed, as far as Graves would later reflect, absolutely nothing. She said pleasantly, "Oh, I do beg your pardon. I was looking for the post office." And then she didn't leave. Chapter 4. Miss Marple Buys Vegetables. The post office in Mellowbrook was, in fact, directly next door to the village hall. This was a geographical fact so obvious. The 2 buildings shared a wall, and the signage for both was clearly visible from the main road. That Miss Marple's claim to have confused the 2 was transparently implausible to anyone paying attention. Inspector Graves was paying attention. He noted the implausibility, filed it somewhere in the back of his mind, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he did not ask her to leave. There was something about her that made asking her to leave feel like the wrong instinct. Not because she was imposing. She was the opposite of imposing. A small woman in a gray wool coat with a slight tendency to hold her knitting bag with both hands, like a woman waiting for a bus. But because she had the quality, rare in Graves's experience, of making the room feel more ordered simply by being in it, as though her presence introduced some organizing principle that had been missing. He said, with the cautious hospitality of a man uncertain of his own motivations, "Can I help you, madam?" She said, "I rather think it may be the other way around." Her name, she explained, was Jane Marple. She was visiting her niece, her brother's daughter, recently married to a solicitor's clerk named Henderson, who had taken a position with a firm in the next town, and chosen Mellowbrook as a place to settle on the grounds that it was quiet and affordable, and had a decent school for the children they intended eventually to have. Miss Marple had come for a fortnight. She had been in the village for 3 days. She had, in those 3 days, already formed opinions about a considerable number of things that she kept largely to herself because, as she explained to Graves with a pleasantness that contained within it something considerably more precise, one finds that people are more forthcoming when they don't feel they're being studied. Graves looked at her. She smiled back with the serene patience of someone entirely comfortable with being looked at. Thomas Hargrove was staring at the table. Cecily Marsh was watching Miss Marple with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile, not welcoming, but the particular alertness of a person who has encountered something unexpected and is still deciding what category to place it in. Mr. Pott had not moved or changed expression since completing his confession, occupying his chair with the settled permanence of a man who has arrived somewhere and has no plans to go anywhere else. Miss Marple looked at each of them in turn, briefly, without emphasis, in the way that a person glances around a room when they enter it, apparently casual, actually comprehensive. Then she set her carrots on the end of the table, sat down in the nearest chair without being invited, and said to Inspector Graves, "You have 3 confessions to the same murder." It was not a question. Graves confirmed this, and then immediately questioned his own decision to confirm it, and then decided it didn't particularly matter because she had clearly already known it. Had known it before she walked through the door, he suspected, from whatever she had overheard in the street outside, where the morning's events had been spreading through the village with the rapid efficiency that small communities apply to significant information. "And you're not sure what to do with them," Miss Marple continued, in the same pleasant observational tone. "I am exploring my options," said Graves with dignity. "Of course." She folded her hands on the table. "May I ask a small question? Not to interfere. I wouldn't dream of interfering, but simply out of curiosity." Graves, who had a feeling that Miss Marple's curiosity was to ordinary curiosity what the ocean is to a glass of water, said, "Go ahead." She turned to Thomas Hargrove. "You said you put the poison in the medication," she said. "Which medication specifically?" Thomas said, "The heart pills, the small white ones." She nodded thoughtfully. Then she turned to Cecily. "And you put it in the wine." "In the Burgundy, yes. The bottle that Dr. Fenwick brought?" Cecily paused. The pause of someone who has not previously considered a question from this particular angle. "Sir Edmund poured most of it himself," she said carefully. I introduced the substance beforehand, before dinner." "Into the bottle? Into his glass?" Miss Marple turned to Mr. Pott, without any change in expression. "And you put it in the medication bottle, 1 week prior." "Yes, ma'am. The same medication bottle Thomas is referring to. The two men looked at each other for the first time since entering the room. It was a brief look, startled, involuntary, the look of two people who have just realized they have been telling the same lie with different details and have simultaneously grasped the structural problem this creates. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she said very quietly and without accusation, as though she were simply thinking aloud, 3 people, 3 methods, 1 death. And each of you arrived here separately this morning, before the police had spoken to any of you. She paused. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of English criminal law, or it is something else entirely. She did not stay long after that. She retrieved her carrots, offered Inspector Graves a look of genuine sympathy that he found both comforting and slightly alarming, and excused herself, with the explanation that her niece would be expecting her for elevenses, and that she didn't like to be late for elevenses because it put the whole morning out of order. At the door she paused, the pause of a woman who has just remembered something, and turned back to the room. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if you might tell me, was there anyone else at dinner last night? Anyone at all, besides the family?" Graves checked his notes. "Dr. Aldous Fenwick," he said. "Family physician. He left around 11. Miss Marple repeated the name softly, as though she were placing it somewhere specific in her memory, where she would be able to find it again quickly. "And has Dr. Fenwick been in to see you this morning?" "No," said Graves. "Not yet." "No," said Miss Marple. "I wouldn't think so." She said it without drama, without implication, in the same pleasant, mild tone she had used throughout, the tone of a woman making a small, inconsequential observation about nothing in particular. But Graves, who was not an unperceptive man, felt something shift in the room. He looked at his 3 confessors. He looked at the door through which Miss Marple had just passed. He looked at his notes, at the name he had just spoken aloud. Dr. Aldous Fenwick. He thought about the wine, the medication, the specific, trusted proximity of a man who had been present all evening and had left before the body was found and had not, knew as of 9:45 on the morning of October the 14th, come forward to say anything at all. He picked up his pencil. This time he did not put it down. Outside on the high street, Miss Marple walked at her usual unhurried pace toward her niece's cottage, her carrots under one arm and her knitting bag over the other. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of October morning that feels like a gift, clear sky, sharp air, the village going about its business, with the careful normalcy of a place trying to convince itself that everything is fine. She passed the war memorial. She passed the Drowning Crow, not yet open. She passed the greengrocer's where old Mr. Sims was arranging apples in his window, with the focused attention of a man for whom this was both livelihood and vocation. She thought about 3 people who had walked into a police station and offered themselves up for a crime they had not committed. She thought about what that required. Not courage exactly, or not only courage. Something more specific than courage. The willingness to absorb someone else's consequence. To place yourself between another person and the thing coming toward them, regardless of what it costs you. She thought about St. Mary Mead and a woman named Dorothy Fitch, who had once confessed to stealing from the church collection box to protect her granddaughter, and how Vicar Clement had known immediately, not because the confession was implausible, but because Dorothy Fitch's hands had been completely still when she made it. frightened people's hands were never still. These three, this morning, their hands had been still. The innocent, Miss Marple thought, turning into the lane toward her niece's cottage, always confess first. The guilty ones were busy doing something else entirely. Chapter 5. Tea, Gossip, and Truth. Miss Marple's niece was named Eleanor Henderson. She was 28, cheerful in the practical rather than performative sense, and had inherited from her family a talent for making people comfortable that expressed itself primarily through the production of excellent tea and the absence of unnecessary questions. She had learned, over the course of several visits from her aunt across many years, that Miss Marple operated on a schedule that appeared to have nothing to do with the observable facts of any given day and everything to do with some internal compass that Eleanor had long since stopped trying to understand and had simply learned to accommodate. So, when Miss Marple arrived at the cottage at 11 o'clock, carrying carrots and the particular expression that Eleanor privately thought of as her working face, pleasant on the surface, somewhere entirely else underneath, Eleanor made the tea, put out the biscuits, and asked no questions. Miss Marple drank her tea and ate 2 biscuits, and looked out the kitchen window at the back garden, where the last of the autumn roses were holding on with the stubborn optimism of things that haven't yet accepted that summer is over. Then she said, "Eleanor, dear, do you know anyone in the village well enough that they would talk to me honestly?" Eleanor considered this. "Mrs. Waverley," she said. "She runs the flower arranging committee. She knows everything about everyone, and she's been trying to tell someone for years." "Perfect," said Miss Marple, and reached for a 3rd biscuit. Mrs. Patricia Waverley lived 4 doors down in a cottage that was aggressively floral both inside and outside. Window boxes, climbing roses, a front door painted the particular shade of yellow that announces to the world that the occupant has strong opinions and is not embarrassed by them. She was 67, recently widowed, and possessed of the conversational energy of a woman who has been the primary keeper of a community's collective memory for decades, and is quietly desperate for someone to appreciate the full scope of what she knows. Miss Marple appeared on her doorstep at 11:30, with a pot of homemade marmalade that Eleanor had provided for exactly this kind of social necessity, and Mrs. Waverley received both the marmalade and the visitor with the enthusiasm of someone who had been expecting, without knowing it, precisely this. They were settled in the front sitting-room with tea within 4 minutes. This was, Miss Marple reflected, an excellent sign. The conversation began, as these conversations always did, with the weather and the garden, and moved through several intermediate subjects: the church restoration fund, the question of the new bus timetable, the general decline in the quality of the post, before arriving, with the inevitability of water finding its level, at Hargrove House. Mrs. Waverley did not need to be steered. She had been building toward Hargrove House since the moment Miss Marple sat down. You could feel it in the way she arranged herself, the way she refilled the teacups with slightly unnecessary frequency, the particular quality of the pauses she left at the end of sentences, each one an invitation. Miss Marple, who understood this kind of conversation the way a musician understands an instrument, simply listened and occasionally asked code, the small, precise questions that opened the next door. "Sir Edmund had been unwell, I understand." "Heart trouble," said Mrs. Waverley, with the gravity of someone for whom medical information about others carries genuine weight. Dr. Fenwick had him on medication for the past 2 years. We all knew about it. Well, one hears things. He looked well enough, I always thought. Better than he deserved, too, frankly. You didn't care for him?" Mrs. Waverley set down her teacup with the deliberateness of a woman choosing her words. "I didn't dislike him personally," she said, which was the specific phrasing of someone who disliked him considerably, but preferred to locate the feeling in something more principled than personal. But he was not a kind man, and unkind men in positions of power, well, one sees the consequences. "The Pott situation," said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Waverley looked at her with the expression of someone surprised to find they don't need to explain something they had expected to explain. "You know about Daniel. I know a little. I should like to know more." Mrs. Waverley knew a great deal more. Daniel Pott had been 25 when it happened. A good boy. Mrs. Waverley said this with the firmness of someone prepared to defend the assessment. Not perfect, not without his difficulties, but fundamentally decent in the way that his father was decent. Quietly, without performance. He had worked on the Hargrove estate for 8 months, and had been, by all accounts, competent and reliable. The discrepancy in the accounts, £40, spread across 3 months, had never been satisfactorily explained. Daniel maintained it was a recording error. Sir Edmund maintained it was theft. The police had been involved, called specifically by Sir Edmund, who had declined the option of handling it privately, and had instead pursued the matter with a thoroughness that struck everyone who knew him as disproportionate to the amount in question. £40, said Mrs. Waverley, and the 2 words contained a library of commentary. He wanted to make an example, said Miss Marple. He wanted to remind everyone what he could do if he chose to. Mrs. Waverley reached for her teacup. Albert Pott never said a word against him afterward. Not one word. Came back to work the following Monday, and continued exactly as before, which I always thought was either extraordinary self-control or something else. What kind of something else? Mrs. Waverley met her eyes. The kind where you decide that words are not the thing you'll use. Miss Marple steered the conversation, after a suitable pause, toward Cecily Marsh. Mrs. Waverley's expression shifted. Less indignation here, more the complicated sympathy that a community reserves for its younger members when they have been damaged by its older ones. Cecily had arrived in June, and the reason for the extended visit had not been officially announced, but had been thoroughly understood. The engagement to William Ashford had been a good one by most measures. The young man was respectable, genuinely fond of Cecily, and from a family in Dorset that had enough financial stability to make the match sensible, without being grand enough to make it suspicious. Sir Edmund had ended it. Not dramatically. He had not forbidden it, had not issued ultimatums. He had simply made a telephone call to William Ashford's father. What was said in that telephone call was not known precisely, but its effects were visible in the letter Cecily received 4 weeks later, and in the way she had moved through Hargrove House since, quietly, carefully, like a person navigating a space that has become subtly hostile. She loved him, said Mrs. Waverley. William? One could tell. It was the kind of love that's inconvenient because it's real. And Sir Edmund knew this. Of course he knew. That was rather the point, I think. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through Mrs. Waverley's climbing roses, and the kitchen clock ticked with the steady reliability of something that has been doing one thing for a very long time, and sees no reason to stop. "Dr. Fenwick," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone introducing a new subject. Something changed in Mrs. Waverley's face. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious as alarm or hesitation. More like the slight adjustment of a person who has shifted their weight. "What about him?" "How long has he been Sir Edmund's physician?" 12 years. 13, perhaps. "And his friend?" "About as long." Mrs. Waverley picked up her teacup, looked into it, set it down again without drinking. "He's a good doctor. Everyone says so. Very attentive, very thorough. But," said Miss Marple, because there was very clearly a but. Mrs. Waverley was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much of what they know belongs to them and how much belongs to the situation. "There was talk," she said finally, "a few months ago, about Sir Edmund's will. Nobody knows the details. Solicitors are discreet, or they're supposed to be. But there was talk that he had made certain arrangements. Private arrangements. Arrangements that someone very close to him would benefit from considerably. Someone in the family." "Not in the family," said Mrs. Waverley. "That was rather the point of the talk." Miss Marple walked home through the village at 1 o'clock, past the War Memorial, and the greengrocer's and the Drowning Crow, which was now open, and producing from its interior the mingled smells of old wood and fresh beer that English public houses have been producing, with admirable consistency, for several centuries. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she didn't yet know, but was beginning to see the shape of. She thought about a will, about a trusted friend, about 12 years of proximity and the very specific kinds of knowledge that proximity produces. She thought about the choirmaster at the church. Mrs. Waverley had mentioned her, briefly, in passing, as someone who had been a close confidant of Sir Edmund's late wife, and who still, out of loyalty to the memory of that gentlewoman, maintained a relationship with the house. She thought she would visit the church tomorrow. There was, she suspected, at least one more door to open before the shape of this thing became fully clear, before the outline resolved itself into something with a face. She already had a feeling about whose face it would be. She had had the feeling since Inspector Graves had spoken the name aloud in the village hall that morning, and she had repeated it quietly to herself, and felt, in the specific way she always felt these things, the small internal click of a piece finding its place. Dr. Aldous Fenwick. She walked on. The October afternoon was shortening around her, the light going golden, and then amber, and then the particular deep blue that precedes the dark, and Mellowbrook was settling into its evening with the practiced calm of a village that has decided, collectively, to keep its composure just a little longer. It would not need to keep it much longer, Miss Marple thought. Not very much longer at all. Chapter 6. The secret Will St. Bridget's Church had stood at the center of Mellowbrook for 600 years. It had survived 2 floods, 1 fire, the English Civil War, and the sustained indifference of several generations who had attended its services out of social obligation rather than genuine conviction, and had somehow, through this complicated relationship, managed to keep it standing anyway. Its walls were the particular thick gray of old stone that has absorbed centuries of weather, and emerged, if not beautiful, then at least permanent. Its interior smelled of candle wax and cold air, and the specific quietness that accumulates in spaces where people have been bringing their grief and their gratitude for longer than anyone can remember. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30 on a Thursday morning, ostensibly to admire the medieval font which Eleanor had mentioned as being of some historical interest. She carried her knitting bag. She wore her gray coat, so she looked exactly like what she was, a visiting elderly lady with an interest in ecclesiastical architecture, and absolutely nothing like what she also was. Mrs. Ruth Holloway had been the church's choirmaster for 19 years, and its informal historian for considerably longer. She was 73, small and precise in her movements, with white hair cut practically short, and the kind of eyes that have spent decades watching people sing, which is, Miss Marple had always thought, one of the more revealing things a person can do, because singing in a choir requires you to be simultaneously present and surrendered, and you cannot entirely hide yourself in that state. She was arranging sheet music on the choir stalls when Miss Marple found her, and she looked up with the measured welcome of someone accustomed to visitors, but not dependent on them. "Miss Marple," she said, after introductions were made. "Eleanor Henderson's aunt." "Yes, she mentioned you might come by." Eleanor had, in fact, said no such thing, but Miss Marple received this information with the serenity of someone who has long since made peace with the small social fictions that smooth the world's operation. "A beautiful building," said Miss Marple, looking up at the vaulted ceiling with genuine appreciation. "One feels the age of it." 600 years of argument and prayer," said Mrs. Holloway. "In roughly equal measure, I've always thought." Miss Marple smiled. She liked this woman immediately, which was, in her experience, not always a reliable guide to anything, but was at least a pleasant starting condition. They sat in the front pew because Mrs. Holloway's knees had developed, in recent years, strong opinions about standing for extended periods, and Miss Marple's had as well, and this shared physical inconvenience created between them the easy solidarity of people who have arrived at the same place by different routes. The conversation moved naturally, as conversations in churches tend to do toward the dead. Mrs. Holloway had known Lady Hargrove, Sir Edmund's wife Margaret, dead now 11 years, with the quiet closeness of women who find each other in the spaces that their husbands' worlds don't occupy. They had arranged flowers together, sung in the same choir for a decade, shared the particular friendship of people who do not need to explain themselves to each other, because they have already been sufficiently explained by the lives they are visibly living. "She was a good woman," said Mrs. Holloway, not warmly, simply factually, in the way of someone stating something that requires no embellishment, because it is simply true. Better than her circumstances, which is the hardest thing to be. "And Sir Edmund?" Miss Marple asked, in the mild tone of someone making polite conversation. Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge and regarded the interior with brief avian judgment before departing. "Sir Edmund," she said carefully, "was a man who understood value. He simply applied it to the wrong things." Miss Marple let the silence settle comfortably before she spoke again. "I wonder," she said, with the thoughtful air of someone pursuing a thread that has only just occurred to them, "whether you knew anything about his will. I ask only because there has been talk in the village. I don't wish to repeat gossip, but there seems to be some uncertainty about his arrangements." Mrs. Holloway looked at her hands, folded in her lap. Then she looked at the altar, at the plain wooden cross that St. Bridget's had always preferred to the more elaborate alternatives. "Margaret told me something," she said finally. "Before she died, she was worried about it." Miss Marple waited. Edmund had made a will, the official one, the one the family knew about, that divided things as you'd expect. The house and estate to Thomas, eventually. Provisions for Cecily. The usual arrangements. She paused. But Margaret knew he had also made a second document. A private arrangement, not a formal will exactly, but something drawn up through a separate solicitor. Someone in London, not the family firm. And this document, said Miss Marple, benefited someone outside the family. Mrs. Holloway looked at her with the expression of someone who has just realized that the conversation has arrived somewhere she did not entirely anticipate, by a route she cannot quite reconstruct. "Dr. Fenwick," she said, not as a confirmation, as a question that had somehow become a statement in the process of being spoken. What did it leave him? Margaret didn't know the precise details, but she understood it to be significant. A portion of the estate's land, the northern fields, she thought, which are worth considerably more than they appear because of what's beneath them. Miss Marple was still. "What is beneath them?" "Water rights," said Mrs. Holloway. "Old rights, legally secured going back to the 1840s. There's been interest from a development company for years. Edmund always refused to sell. But whoever inherits those rights," she stopped, "would be in a position to sell." Miss Marple finished quietly, and to profit very considerably from doing so. The church was silent around them. Margaret didn't trust it, said Mrs. Holloway. She said Edmund had changed toward Fenwick in the last years, became dependent, she said, which was not a word she associated with Edmund as a rule. Dependent in what sense? Medically? Emotionally, perhaps? The way old men sometimes do with their doctors, begin to give them a kind of authority that goes beyond the professional. She looked at the cross again. She thought Fenwick had encouraged it. Deliberately, Miss Marple stood, slowly, with the careful movements of a woman who respects the complaints her body makes while declining to be entirely governed by them. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," she said. "You have been extremely helpful." "Have I?" said Mrs. Holloway. I'm not entirely sure what I've helped with." "With the truth," said Miss Marple simply, "which is always the most useful thing." She collected her knitting bag. She walked to the door, her footsteps quiet on the old stone floor. At the threshold she paused, the pause that Inspector Graves was beginning across the village to associate specifically with her, and turned back. "The northern fields," she said. "Do you know, had Sir Edmund shown any sign recently of changing his mind about the second document, of reconsidering Dr. Fenwick's portion?" Mrs. Holloway thought about this carefully. "Actually," she said slowly, "yes. There was talk, just last month, that he had contacted the family solicitor about reviewing his arrangements." Miss Marple nodded once, with the small, precise satisfaction of a person who has just found the last piece of something they have been assembling for several days. "Yes," she said softly, "to no one in particular. That would do it." She walked out into the October morning. Behind her, in the cold quiet of St. Bridget's, Mrs. Holloway sat very still and felt the particular sensation of someone who has just understood, several minutes after the fact, exactly what conversation she has been part of. Chapter 7. The Man Who Said Nothing. There is a particular kind of person who survives entirely on the goodwill of others, not through charm. Exactly. Charm is too visible, too easily identified, and therefore too easily distrusted. No, this is something quieter, a cultivated reliability, a studied warmth that presents itself so consistently over so many years that people stop questioning whether it is genuine and simply begin to depend on it as they depend on other stable features of their landscape. The post office, the church, the river that moves slowly but always in the same direction. Doctor. Aldous Fenwick had spent 58 years becoming exactly this kind of person. He had done it well. He had done it so well that even now, 2 days after Sir Edmund Hargrove's death, as the village of Mellowbrook processed its shock in the way that villages do, in kitchens and garden paths, and brief loaded exchanges outside the post office, Dr. Fenwick moved through it all with the gentle gravity of a man genuinely bereaved. He had been seen at the Drowning Crow on the evening of the 14th, nursing a single whiskey and speaking quietly to whoever sat near him about what a loss it was, what a terrible loss. Edmund had been his closest friend for more than a decade. People had patted his arm. People had refilled his glass. People had said, "Poor Aldous," because that is what you say to a man who appears to be suffering. And appearing to suffer is something Dr. Fenwick had always been exceptionally good at. Miss Marple observed all of this from a distance, the careful distance of a woman who understands that the best way to watch someone is to be somewhere they are not quite looking. She saw him at the greengrocer's on the morning of the 15th, exchanging solemn words with Mr. Sims about the uncertainty of life and the suddenness of loss. She saw him outside the church on the 16th, speaking to the vicar with the bowed-head attentiveness of a man in genuine spiritual reflection. She noted the way he spoke to everyone and said nothing, the way his grief, examined carefully, produced no specific memories, no particular stories about Edmund, no recalled conversations, nothing that could only have come from someone who had actually been that close to a person for that long. Instead, there were gestures, sighs, the occasional pause before speaking that implied depths of feeling too profound for easy articulation. Miss Marple had known men like this before. In Street, Mary Mead, there had been a man named Gerald Hartley who had cried at his wife's funeral so convincingly that the entire village had spent 3 months bringing him casseroles, right up until the moment the insurance investigation concluded. The tears, she had always found, were the easiest part to produce. It was the details that gave people away. She arranged to encounter Dr. Fenwick on the afternoon of the 16th, not by accident, precisely, but by the kind of deliberate casualness that requires more planning than actual accidents do. She had learned from Eleanor that he took a walk every afternoon along the river path that ran behind the village, a habit of 12 years, apparently, that he had maintained with the regularity of a man who values routine. Miss Marple positioned herself on the bench at the river's bend at 3 o'clock, her knitting in her lap, and her face arranged in the peaceful expression of a woman enjoying the autumn air with no particular agenda. He appeared around the bend at 3:10, walking at a measured pace with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the path, and he saw her, and for just a fraction of a second before his face composed itself into welcome, Miss Marple saw something else. Not alarm. Not quite. More like the microsecond adjustment of a person who has encountered an unexpected variable and is rapidly calculating its significance. Then it was gone, replaced by the warm, open smile that Mellowbrook trusted. "Good afternoon," he said. "You must be Miss Marple. I've heard about you. Eleanor Henderson's aunt." "The very same," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Do sit down, Dr. Fenwick. My neck doesn't manage looking upward for extended conversations as well as it once did." He sat. He was good at sitting. Easy, unhurried, the posture of a man with nothing to hide and nowhere to be. They talked about the village first, the weather, the peculiar quiet that had descended since the discovery at Hargrove House. Dr. Fenwick spoke about Sir Edmund with the practiced sadness of a musician playing a familiar piece, technically correct, emotionally smooth, lacking the small imperfections that genuine grief tends to produce. Miss Marple listened. She knitted. She asked, at intervals, the small questions that opened things. "You were his physician for a long time," she said. "That must create a particular kind of closeness. Knowing someone's body the way a doctor does, it's rather intimate, isn't it? Rather like knowing someone's secrets." "It is," said Fenwick. "You learn to hold that knowledge carefully." "His heart condition," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone following a natural conversational thread. "Serious, was it?" "Manageable," said Fenwick. "With the right medication and reasonable care, he could have had another 10 years. He paused. "Should have had." "The medication," said Miss Marple. "You prescribed it yourself." "Of course, I was his physician. And you would have been familiar with, forgive me, I'm an old woman with a curious mind, the specific interactions of those medications. What would affect them? What would accelerate them? The river moved beside them, slow and dark, carrying leaves on its surface with the unhurried indifference of water that has been moving longer than anyone watching it has been alive. Any physician would know that," said Fenwick. His voice had not changed. His posture had not changed. But something had. Something Miss Marple felt rather than observed. A subtle shift in the quality of his stillness, the way a room feels different when a door has been quietly locked from inside. "Of course," said Miss Marple agreeably. "Of course." She moved the conversation gently to the will. Not directly. She would never approach something directly when an angle was available. She mentioned, as though it had just occurred to her, that she had heard the village talking about Sir Edmund's estate, about Thomas and what would happen to the house, about the uncertainty that death always creates when a man of property dies suddenly. "These things take time to resolve," said Fenwick. "They do," agreed Miss Marple, "especially when there are multiple documents, multiple solicitors." She let this sit for precisely the right number of seconds. "I understand that's sometimes the case with complex estates." Fenwick looked at the river. "I wouldn't know about that," he said. "I was his doctor, not his solicitor." "No," said Miss Marple. "Of course not." She knitted 3 more rows in comfortable silence. Then she said, with the reflective air of someone following a private train of thought to its natural conclusion, "It's interesting, isn't it? The timing of things. Sir Edmund apparently contacted his family solicitor recently about reviewing certain private arrangements." She did not look at Fenwick. One wonders what prompted that. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had an interior quality, the silence of someone doing rapid, invisible work behind a still face. "People review their arrangements from time to time," said Fenwick evenly. "It's sensible practice." "Absolutely," said Miss Marple. "Though I imagine for the people those arrangements affect, the reviewing must feel rather urgent, rather threatening." She looked up from her knitting with the mild, unassuming gaze of a woman discussing nothing in particular. don't you think?" Fenwick stood. He did it smoothly, not abruptly, not with the jerkiness of a man retreating, but with the controlled deliberateness of a man deciding that this particular bench, this particular conversation, this particular afternoon had concluded. "It's getting cold," he said. "I should finish my walk." "Of course," said Miss Marple warmly. "Do take care, Dr. Fenwick. These river paths can be slippery in October." He walked away at the same measured pace at which he had arrived. Miss Marple watched him go. She noted the set of his shoulders, the way his hands had moved from his coat pockets to his sides, small fists, loosely held, the invisible tension of a man maintaining composure through the deliberate management of his own body. She thought, "He knows that I know," and then, more quietly, "He will do something about it." She picked up her knitting and began walking back toward the village, a little faster than her usual pace. She needed to speak to Inspector Graves, tonight, if possible. Or Chapter 8. One last cup of tea. Inspector Graves had developed, over the course of 4 days, a habit of checking his watch whenever Miss Marple entered a room. Not because she was late. She was never late, arriving always with the punctuality of someone who considers other people's time a serious moral matter, but because conversations with Miss Marple had a quality of temporal distortion about them. You sat down, expecting 10 minutes, and looked up to find an hour had passed, and the light had changed, and you knew 3 things you hadn't known before, and were uncertain how you had come to know them. She arrived at the police station at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 16th, declined the offer of tea, with the explanation that she had recently had some, and found 2 cups in an afternoon sufficient, and sat across from Graves with her knitting bag on her lap, and the expression of a woman who has made several decisions and would like to share them. Graves uncapped his pen. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything, methodically, without drama, in the ordered sequence of a person who has arranged information into its most useful shape before presenting it. The second will. The water rights beneath the northern fields. The development company. The London solicitor. Separate from the family firm. Sir Edmund's recent contact with his family solicitor about reviewing his private arrangements. She told him about Mrs. Holloway's account of Lady Hargrove's concern, the deliberate cultivation of dependency, the 12 years of careful proximity, the way Dr. Fenwick had made himself indispensable not only to Sir Edmund's health, but to his emotional landscape. She told him about the river path conversation, about the microsecond of calculation she had seen behind Fenwick's eyes before the warmth replaced it, about the way his hands had made small fists at his sides when he stood to leave. "He knows I'm close," she said, "which means he will either run or he will attempt to consolidate his position somehow. Destroy evidence, perhaps. The London solicitor's documents, if he could reach them first, if he could contest the second will or obscure his knowledge of it. He can't destroy a will," said Graves. "He can't destroy the will itself," said Miss Marple patiently, "but he can destroy evidence of the motive. And without the motive clearly established, 3 people have already confessed to this murder, Inspector. A defense barrister would find that rather useful." Graves put down his pen. He picked it up again. "You think he'll run," he said. "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that he is the kind of man who has always had an exit prepared. Men like Dr. Fenwick do not commit calculated murders without having thought about what comes after. He has been planning this for some time. The murder itself was planned. The method was intelligent, clinical, designed to look like a natural acceleration of an existing heart condition. If Thomas hadn't found that letter about the will, if Cecily hadn't been watching the wine all evening out of her own separate suspicions, if Albert Pott hadn't— She paused. Well, if any one of them had not carried their own private guilt into that house on that particular evening and been watching, separately, for something that none of them actually did, it might have worked. Their guilt made them witnesses, said Graves slowly. Their guilt made them watchful, said Miss Marple, and watchful people notice things. Not the right things, necessarily, but enough. They agreed between them on a plan. It was not a complicated plan. Miss Marple had always believed that complicated plans were evidence of unclear thinking, and that the most reliable approaches were usually the simplest ones, provided they were executed with sufficient patience and attention. The plan required one thing from Inspector Graves and one thing from Miss Marple, and these two things needed to happen in the correct sequence. Graves would contact the London solicitor that evening. He had the name now, obtained through a quiet conversation with the family solicitor, whom Miss Marple had suggested he telephone that afternoon with a specific question. He would confirm the existence and contents of the second document. He would also arrange for a constable to maintain discreet observation of Dr. Fenwick's house and movements through the night. Miss Marple would invite Dr. Fenwick for tea. Graves looked at her when she said this. "Tea," he repeated. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "at Eleanor's cottage. I will send a note this evening, a friendly note, expressing that I so enjoyed our conversation by the river and wondered if he might spare an hour. I will mention," she added, with the mild precision of a woman choosing a key for a specific lock, "that I have been thinking about what he said regarding Sir Edmund's medication, that I have some questions that I believe only a physician could properly answer." "You're going to make him think you're uncertain," said Graves, "that you're still working it out." "I'm going to make him think," said Miss Marple, "that I am a curious old woman who is almost there, but not quite, and that a sufficiently reassuring conversation with a trusted medical professional might put my mind at rest and send me back to St. Mary Mead without having said anything inconvenient to anyone." Graves was quiet for a moment. "And what will actually happen at this tea?" "You will be in the garden," said Miss Marple. "Eleanor has a perfectly adequate garden shed with a direct sight line to the kitchen window. I will leave the window open. I will make sufficient noise with the teacups that the conversation is clearly audible." She paused. "You may want to bring Constable Webb." Dr. Fenwick arrived at Eleanor's cottage at 10 o'clock the following morning. He arrived with a small bunch of chrysanthemums, yellow, cheerful, the flowers of a man who pays attention to the social details. Eleanor received them with the pleasant composure of a woman who had been briefed on the situation at 7 that morning and had spent the intervening hours being admirable about it. She put the chrysanthemums in water, offered Dr. Fenwick a smile of uncomplicated welcome, and retreated to the upstairs room where Miss Marple had suggested she remain for the duration of the morning. Miss Marple was in the kitchen. The table was set with Eleanor's good cups, a pot of tea already steeped, a plate of shortbread that Miss Marple had made herself at 7:30 because she found baking clarifying in the way that some people find walking clarifying. Fenwick came in and sat and accepted his tea with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in domestic spaces Another cultivated quality, Miss Marple had always thought, the ability to sit in a stranger's kitchen and appear to belong there. "You said you had questions," he said, "about the medication." "I did," said Miss Marple, pouring her own cup. "I hope you don't mind. It has been bothering me, the way it works, medically, the heart medication." "Of course," said Fenwick, happy to explain. "You see," said Miss Marple in the thoughtful tone of someone genuinely puzzling something through, "I have been thinking about the poison. The type that was found, digitalis, I understand, in significantly elevated concentration, and it occurred to me that digitalis in excessive quantities would produce effects very similar to a natural cardiac event in a patient already on heart medication." "That's correct," said Fenwick steadily. "It's one of the reasons such cases can be difficult to identify without thorough toxicology." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and the medication Sir Edmund was already prescribed. That was also digitalis-based, wasn't it? A standard formulation for his particular condition." "It was." "So," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup with the gentle precision of someone arriving at the point they have been building toward, someone who introduced additional digitalis into his medication bottle would have known that the excess would be absorbed gradually, over days, perhaps, not all at once, and that by the time he experienced the fatal event, it would appear entirely consistent with the natural progression of his condition. She looked at him. "That would require specific medical knowledge." "It would," said Fenwick. His voice was perfectly level. "It would also be consistent with what Thomas Hargrove described in his confession." "Thomas," said Miss Marple gently, "does not know the difference between digitalis and aspirin. He described putting a substance into the medication. He did not describe what substance. He could not have, because he didn't do it." She tilted her head slightly. "Nor did Cecily, nor did Mr. Pott." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October garden was perfectly still. A blackbird moved on the lawn. The garden shed, Miss Marple noted peripherally, had its door fractionally open. "They confessed," said Fenwick. "They confessed to protect each other," said Miss Marple, "because they each believed one of the others had done it, and they each loved someone in that house enough to stand in front of them. Thomas thought Cecily had finally done what she'd long considered. Cecily thought Thomas had reached his limit. Albert Pott thought both of them were too young to carry what he was old enough to bear." She looked at Fenwick steadily. "None of them thought of you, because you were the trusted friend, the reliable fixture, the man who had been there for 12 years. Fenwick set down his teacup. He set it down carefully, precisely, without sound, the gesture of a man exercising the last available form of control. "You can't prove any of this," he said. "The London solicitor," said Miss Marple, "was contacted yesterday evening by Inspector Graves. The second will has been confirmed. The water rights, the value of the northern fields." She paused. "And Sir Edmund's family solicitor has confirmed that he telephoned 3 weeks ago requesting a meeting to review his private arrangements, a meeting that was scheduled for the 21st of October. Something moved across Fenwick's face. Not dramatic. Nothing collapsed or crumbled. It was more like watching a very well-maintained structure acknowledge, for the first time, the presence of a crack. "He was going to change it," said Miss Marple quietly. "Remove you from the document. You had spent 12 years cultivating his trust, managing his health, making yourself indispensable, and he was going to remove you, and you found out." "How?" Fenwick stopped. His housekeeper mentioned the call to Mrs. Hedges, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Hedges mentioned it to her sister. Her sister is in the flower-arranging committee. She folded her hands. In a village, Dr. Fenwick, everything eventually reaches the flower-arranging committee. The garden shed door opened fully. Inspector Graves stepped out into the October morning, Constable Webb behind him, and came toward the kitchen window with the measured pace of a man who has heard everything he needed to hear and knows precisely what to do next. Fenwick looked at the window. He looked at Miss Marple. She met his eyes with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a woman who has seen this moment before, in different rooms, with different people, and has never found it satisfying exactly. Only necessary. "More tea," she said. He said nothing. Outside, the garden gate opened. Chapter 9. The innocent always confess first. They took Dr. Fenwick away at 10:30 on a Thursday morning. There was no struggle, no dramatic declaration. He walked out of Eleanor's garden gate, between Inspector Graves and Constable Webb, with the careful composure of a man who has decided that dignity is the last thing available to him, and intends to keep it. The chrysanthemums he had brought were still in their vase on Eleanor's kitchen windowsill, yellow and entirely cheerful, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. Miss Marple watched from the garden path until the motor car disappeared around the bend at the end of the lane. Then she went back inside and finished her tea. The 3 confessions were formally withdrawn the following morning. Thomas Hargrove sat across from Inspector Graves and retracted his statement with the quiet relief of a man setting down something very heavy that he had been carrying for several days. Not gracefully, not without cost, but with the specific exhale of someone whose body has been waiting for permission to stop bracing. He did not ask how Miss Marple had known. He did not ask much of anything. He simply signed the paper that Graves put in front of him, and then sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing, before he stood and walked out into the October morning, and stood on the pavement outside the village hall, and breathed. Cecily Marsh cried when she withdrew hers. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic person, but in the quiet, helpless way of someone whose body has decided to process several months of accumulated pressure all at once and cannot be reasoned with about the timing. She apologized for the crying. Inspector Graves, who had daughters, told her not to be absurd and offered her his handkerchief, which she accepted and did not return, and he did not mention. Albert Pott said very little. He signed his retraction, nodded once at Graves, and walked back to Hargrove House where, in the strange interim of a place whose owner has died and whose future is not yet determined, there were still things that needed doing. Leaves on the drive, the kitchen garden putting itself to bed for winter. The elm trees standing in their long row, unhurried and unchanged, their roots pushing up through the gravel with the patient certainty of things that have been here longer than the trouble, and expect to be here long after it has resolved. Miss Marple called on Thomas 3 days before she was due to leave Mellowbrook. She found him in the drawing room that had been put back in order, the carpet cleaned as thoroughly as it could be, the chair in which his father had died reupholstered in a different fabric, because Thomas had decided, with the quiet practicality of a man beginning to make his own decisions, that he did not want to sit in the same chair. He offered her tea. She accepted. They sat by the window that looked out over the valley, the hills carrying their autumn colors toward the gray of November, and talked for an hour about nothing particularly significant. The house, his plans for the estate, the possibility of bringing the walled garden back to something like its former condition. He did not mention his father except once, near the end, when he said with the careful honesty of someone still working something out, "I did hate him. I want you to know I'm not pretending I didn't." "I know," said Miss Marple. "But I didn't kill him." "I know that, too." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you believe that? Before you had any proof, why did you believe we were innocent?" Miss Marple looked out at the valley for a moment, at the slow river and the turning hills, and the gray church spire rising from the center of Mellowbrook, like a question that has been asked so many times it has become part of the landscape. "Because you came forward," she said, "all three of you, separately, without coordination, before the police had spoken to any of you." She turned to look at him. Guilty people do not do that. Guilty people are busy being somewhere else, being seen by someone else, building the architecture of their innocence brick by careful brick. They do not walk into police stations and offer themselves. "We were trying to protect each other," said Thomas. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is precisely what innocent people do." She left Mellowbrook on a Friday. Eleanor drove her to the station in the small motor car that her husband used for his commute, and that Eleanor drove with cheerful aggression, and they said goodbye on the platform with the slightly compressed warmth of people who are fond of each other and have learned to contain it in the time available. "Will you come back?" Eleanor asked. "Villages like Mellowbrook," said Miss Marple, picking up her bag, "tend to find me when they need me." The train arrived. She boarded it, found a window seat, arranged her knitting bag on the seat beside her, and looked out as the platform slid away and the village disappeared behind its hills, the church spire the last thing visible and then gone. She thought about Dr. Fenwick, about 12 years of patient, calculated performance, about what it requires to maintain a false face for that long, to sit across dinner tables and pour wine and ask after people's health and feel nothing that you show. She did not feel satisfaction about his arrest. She felt, as she always felt at these conclusions, the particular sadness of someone who has confirmed something she had hoped might be wrong. Evil with good manners was still evil. It was simply harder to see coming. She picked up her knitting and watched the English countryside move past the window, fields and hedgerows, and occasional farmhouses standing in their landscapes, with the solid self-sufficiency of things that have no interest in being anything other than what they are. She thought about 3 people who had walked into a police station and said, "I did it to protect someone they loved." She thought about what that meant, what it said about the human capacity for sacrifice, the willingness to absorb consequence, to place yourself between someone you love and the thing moving toward them, without calculation, without guarantee, simply because love in its most essential form is not a feeling but a decision. The guilty hide. The innocent step forward. She had known this for a long time, had known it since St. Mary Mead, since Dorothy Fitch and her still hands, since 100 other rooms in 100 other villages, where the truth had been hiding in plain sight inside the most ordinary human gestures. It was, she thought, both the most predictable thing about people and the most remarkable. The train moved on through the October afternoon, carrying her home through the gold and amber English countryside, and Miss Marple knitted, and the world outside the window was very beautiful, and the case, like all the others before it, was closed. Outro. There is something that detective stories rarely tell you. They give you the murder, They give you the suspects, the clues, the brilliant mind that assembles it all into something clean and resolved. They give you the arrest and the explanation, and the satisfying click of a case closing like a well-made box. What they rarely give you is this: the morning after. The ordinary Thursday that follows the extraordinary week, the kettle boiling, the leaves still falling, the village of Mellowbrook waking up and making its breakfast, and continuing, as villages always do, with the quiet stubbornness of something that has survived worse and expects to survive more. Evil had lived among them for 12 years. It had attended their dinner parties and treated their ailments and borrowed their umbrellas and returned them. It had worn a good coat and kept its appointments and been, by every visible measure, one of them. And they had not seen it. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply the condition of being human. We are built for connection, for trust, for the assumption of goodwill in the people who sit across our tables. We are not built to see through things. We are built to see them as they present themselves. Miss Marple was simply the rare exception. A woman who had spent a lifetime watching people with the patient. An unsentimental love of someone who accepts human nature entirely, its darkness alongside its light, and therefore could not be surprised by either. She would return to St. Mary Mead. She would tend her garden, and attend her church, and drink her tea, and watch her village with those pale, quiet eyes that missed nothing. And the next time a village needed her, it would find her. It always did. The heart that confesses freely is never the heart to fear. Fear the heart that stays silent and smiles. Miss Jane Marple.